The dog wouldn't look at Sergeant Holloway. That was the first thing anyone noticed, and it shouldn't have been remarkable. Dogs look away from people all the time. But Kodiak wasn't people. Kodiak was a 9-year-old Belgian Malinois with 2 tours in Afghanistan, a commendation from the RCMP's National Division, and a handler who had worked him through things that would have broken a lesser animal twice over. Kodiak looked at everything. He catalogued every face, every smell, every shift in the air pressure of a room. It was what he was built for, what he was born for. He was not looking at Sergeant Holloway. He was looking at the old man sitting alone at gate C-17 in the Ottawa Macdonald-Cartier International Airport, in the plastic chair nearest the window with a brown paper bag in his lap and a paperback novel face down on the seat beside him. The man was reading nothing. He was simply watching the tarmac, the way certain men watch things, not with the idle vacancy of a bored traveler, but with the patient, cataloging stillness of someone who has spent a long time learning that what you see coming toward you across open ground can mean the difference between going home and not going home at all. His name, according to the boarding pass folded neatly in the breast pocket of his canvas jacket, was Thomas Vale. He was 71 years old. He had a trim white beard, hands that were brown from outdoor work, and a carry-on bag that was smaller than most people brought for a weekend trip. He was flying to Yellowknife. When the gate agent had asked him the purpose of his visit, he had said he was going to see his granddaughter's hockey game. She played defense. He was very proud of her. None of that was why Kodiak was staring at him. The dog had been in restraint harness since they cleared security 40 minutes earlier, and in that time Holloway had led him through 2 terminal sweeps, a full circuit of the C concourse, and a secondary screening area where 3 other handlers with 3 other dogs had converged for a handoff on a sensitive cargo transfer. The other dogs had done their jobs without incident. Kodiak had done his job without incident. He had been by every metric exactly the steady, professional animal he always was. Then they had passed gate C-17 on their way to the security office, and Kodiak had stopped. Not a play stop, not a distraction stop, not the slow, reluctant drag of a tired dog who wanted to investigate a food wrapper. He had stopped as if someone had grabbed the back of his harness and held him in place, and he had turned his head toward the window seats, and he had found Thomas Vale, and he had not moved since. Sergeant Holloway was 28 years old. She had been a handler for 4 years. She was good at her job, thorough and patient and attentive to her animal in all the ways the training manuals specified, and a few that they didn't. But she had never seen Kodiak do this. She didn't know what this was. "Come on, boy," she said, keeping her voice low and even. "Cody, let's go." He didn't go. His ears were forward, his body low and coiled, radiating a tension that Holloway could feel through the handle of the lead. He wasn't in prey drive, he wasn't in threat detection. He was in something she didn't have a word for because she had never seen it before. It looked almost like recognition. Staff Sergeant Raymond Leclerc appeared from around the corner of the gate agent's desk, coffee in one hand and a clipboard in the other, and took in the scene with the particular kind of swift assessment that 14 years in the RCMP's Integrated Security Unit had given him as a reflex. He saw his best dog standing rigidly in the middle of a public concourse, staring at a civilian. He saw his youngest handler looking flustered. He saw the civilian in question, who had not yet looked up from the window. Leclerc set the clipboard on the desk. "Holloway, what's happening with him?" "I don't know, Staff Sergeant. He just stopped. He won't break." Leclerc crossed to them, crouched briefly at Kodiak's level, looked at the dog's eyes, looked at the direction of his gaze, and then straightened up. His expression gave nothing away. He was the kind of man whose face had become, over many years of deliberate practice, essentially unreadable in professional situations. It was a useful quality. He looked at the old man by the window, assessed him with the same thoroughness he gave every situation, and found nothing overtly concerning. Old, calm, sitting alone, not watching the room. "Stay here with him," he said to Holloway. "I'll have a word." He walked to gate C-17 with the unhurried confidence of someone who had done this many times before, which he had. He stopped a few feet from the old man's chair and said, in the polite, direct way of a person who does not need to perform authority because he has never been without it, "Good afternoon, sir. I'm Staff Sergeant Leclerc, RCMP Security. Routine check. Do you mind if I ask what brings you to the airport today?" Thomas Vale looked up from the window. His eyes were gray, the color of ice over deep water, And they did the same thing to Leclerc that Kodiak's had done to Holloway. They assessed him, quickly and completely, and then they settled into a kind of patient neutrality that was not the neutrality of a man who had nothing to hide, but the neutrality of a man who had been assessed by professionals far more experienced than Leclerc, and had found the experience unremarkable. "Flying to Yellowknife," Vale said. His voice was low and unhurried, worn smooth by decades, the consonants vaguely maritime. "My granddaughter has a tournament. I promised I'd be there. That's good of you." Leclerc kept it conversational. "Can I ask you to stay seated for a moment? One of our dogs seems to have taken an interest in you, and I want to make sure everything's all right." Vale's gaze moved past Leclerc's shoulder to where Kodiak was still locked in that strange, vibrating stillness, and something moved across the old man's face. It was brief, barely a flicker, the way a candle moves in a draft. It might have been recognition. It might have been something closer to grief. "All right," Vale said. Leclerc returned to Holloway. In his absence, Kodiak had not moved. He was breathing through his nose, slow and deliberate, and the muscles along his shoulders were trembling slightly with what looked like the effort of restraint. Not the restraint of an animal holding back aggression. The restraint of an animal holding back something else entirely. "He's not alerting," Leclerc said quietly, standing beside Holloway and watching the dog. "Not in any way I recognize. No, he's not." Holloway hesitated. "He looks like he wants to go to him, not away from him. Toward." Leclerc was quiet for a moment. Corporal Yves Tanguay materialized from the direction of the security office with two other handlers and their dogs, summoned by the radio call Holloway had put in 5 minutes earlier. Tanguay was young, mid-20s, the kind of person who had arrived at competence recently enough that he still wore it with some effort. He had good instincts, but he was not yet confident in them, which sometimes made him compensate with certainty about things he didn't fully understand. He looked at the old man. He looked at Kodiak. He looked at the other two dogs, who had both gone still and alert, their attention pulled toward the window seats with the same inexplicable magnetism. "3 animals," he said, "all locking on the same civilian with no prior association." He said it with the clipped efficiency of someone summarizing for a report. "That's an incident. We should move him to secondary." "He's done nothing," Holloway said. "The dogs say otherwise." "The dogs aren't alerting. There." She stopped. "I don't know what they're doing, but it isn't an alert." Tanguay looked at Leclerc, the way junior officers look at senior ones when they want the senior one to agree with them. Leclerc didn't oblige. He was watching Kodiak. The dog had begun to make a sound. It was low and soft, barely audible over the ambient noise of the terminal, and it wasn't a growl. It was something closer to a whine, but not a whine of distress. If Holloway had been pressed to name it, she would have said it was the sound of an animal trying to communicate something it didn't have a command for, something outside the vocabulary it had been given. All 3 dogs were doing it now, a low, reverberant hum of confusion and urgency. The other handlers were exchanging glances. Passengers near the gate were beginning to notice. Tanguay made a decision. He was the kind of person who made decisions when he was uncomfortable, because the appearance of action felt safer than the appearance of uncertainty. He walked to gate C-17, stopped in front of Thomas Vale, and said, with a briskness that carried the edge of a person who needed to feel in control of something, "Sir, I need you to come with me." Vale looked at him the way you look at weather, without particular emotion, but with complete attention. "Why?" "Our animals are showing an unusual response to your presence. It's protocol to conduct a secondary." "I haven't done anything, sir. This isn't an accusations procedure. If you could just, Corporal." Vale's voice hadn't changed in volume, but something in it had changed. The way the pressure in a room changes before a storm, almost imperceptible, but felt in the body before it's registered by the mind. "I have a flight in 40 minutes. My granddaughter is in Yellowknife, and she is 11 years old, and she has been asking me for 3 months whether I was coming to this tournament. I told her yes. I intend to be on that aircraft." Tanguay felt something shift in the air around him and couldn't have said what it was. He pressed forward anyway. "I understand that, sir, but your dogs," Vale said, "are not reacting to a threat." The way he said it. Not as a guess, not as a protest, as a statement of fact, specific and technical and completely certain, the way a surgeon says a procedure is routine, not to reassure you, but because it is true and they know it, and there is no version of this in which it is otherwise. Tanguay stopped. Vale looked past him, toward the 3 animals in the concourse. His gray eyes moved from dog to dog, and something in his posture settled. A minute adjustment, barely visible, the way a dial moves from one frequency to another. He stood up. He didn't move toward the dogs. He didn't need to. He simply stood, and the quality of his presence in the space changed in a way that Holloway, watching from 20 feet away, felt before she understood. The trembling in Kodiak's shoulders went still. The sound the dogs were making tapered and died, not cut off abruptly, but fading like a radio losing signal. 3 highly trained working animals stood in a busy airport concourse and went quiet, and they looked at Thomas Vale with an expression that Holloway had not known dogs could have, an expression that was less alertness than it was attentiveness, less fear than it was waiting. Vale said 2 words. He said them quietly, in a language that was not English or French, not quite either, something older, worn down to its essentials. A language that felt less like speech than like a frequency. All 3 dogs lay down, not one at a time, not in sequence, simultaneously, completely, without a command from any of their handlers. Kodiak folded to the floor with a long, slow exhale, his chin coming to rest on his forepaws, his eyes still fixed on Vale but softened now, the tension gone from his body as though a current had been switched off. The other 2 dogs matched him, breathing out, settling, their tails giving slow, single sweeps against the terminal floor. The silence was remarkable. Around the gate, passengers had stopped moving. A woman with a rolling suitcase had paused mid-step and was watching with her hand at her mouth. The gate agent was standing very still behind her desk, holding a boarding pass she had forgotten to issue. Tanguay stood in the middle of it all and could not speak. Holloway looked at Leclerc. Leclerc was watching Vale, and his face, for the first time in as long as Holloway could remember, was not unreadable. It was the face of a man recalibrating. Vale sat back down. He picked up his paperback. He set it back down without opening it. Tanguay found his voice. "How did you do that?" Vale didn't answer right away. He looked at his hands, the way people look at something familiar when they are deciding how much of it to show. His hands were unremarkable, brown and weathered, the knuckles of his right hand carrying a long, thin scar that curved across 3 fingers and disappeared under his sleeve, the kind of scar that comes from a cord or a leash, pulling through a grip at speed, burning through leather and then through skin. His left thumb bore a small puckered mark, the precise shape and depth of a canine tooth that had caught flesh during something quick and close. Staff Sergeant Leclerc had walked to the gate while Tanguay was still standing there. He had seen the scars. He had noted them the first time when he'd come to speak to the old man, and he had filed them without comment the way he filed most things. He crouched now so he was level with Vale, a thing he rarely did, and he said quietly enough that Tanguay could not hear, "You've worked dogs before." It wasn't a question. Vale looked at him. "Long time ago. What were those words?" Vale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The first one means something like, 'I see you,' not 'I acknowledge you.' I see you, the way you are right now, what you're feeling, what you're carrying. The second one means something like, 'You can put it down.'" Leclerc stayed crouched. "Where does that come from?" "Old program. Doesn't exist anymore." Vale glanced at the dogs. Kodiak was still watching him, tail moving slowly, the expression on his face something close to peace. "These animals, their bloodlines go back to some of the original breeding stock. It's written into them somewhere. Not the words specifically, the principle behind the words." He paused. "They knew someone like me was in the room before I knew they were there. That's what all the noise was about. They had a signal they couldn't place, and it was making them anxious. Like hearing a voice you know from a long time ago, and not being able to remember the face." Leclerc stood. He looked at the dogs, then at Tanguay, who was still standing in the same place, looking at the old man the way people look at things they can't categorize. "Corporal," Leclerc said. "Staff Sergeant. The gentleman is cleared. He has a flight to catch." Tanguay opened his mouth, closed it. He was a person who had an instinct for protocol, and protocol said that what had just happened was a security event requiring documentation and secondary review and a minimum of 3 forms. But protocol had not been written for this. Protocol had not anticipated Thomas Vale. He looked at Leclerc, and Leclerc held his gaze with the particular steadiness of a man who does not need to explain himself, and after a moment Tanguay nodded and stepped aside. Leclerc turned back to Vale. "I apologize for the disruption, Mr. Vale." Vale shook his head. "Your corporal was doing his job. Young, but he's got good instincts. He moved to contain the situation before it escalated. That's not nothing." He looked in Tanguay's direction, and his voice carried just enough that the corporal could hear it. The instinct to protect your detail is the right one. Learning when protecting it means stepping back is the part that takes time. You'll get there. Tanguay looked at the floor. He was not the kind of person who flushed easily, but something moved across his face that was very close to it. He gave a short nod. Holloway had walked Kodiak to the area near the gate. The dog was calm now, fully calm, and when he came within a few feet of Vale, he sat without being asked, and looked up at the old man with an expression so attentive and settled that it made Holloway's chest ache slightly, in the way you feel when you see something complete. "Can I ask?" Holloway said, because she couldn't help it. "What program? What were you doing before?" Vale looked at Kodiak. He reached out a hand, knuckles first, the correct way, and the dog pressed his nose against it immediately, a gesture of trust that Holloway had never seen Kodiak give anyone in under 10 minutes. Vale's hand moved to the dog's ear, a brief practice touch. "Joint program," Vale said, "Canadian and American. Late 80s, early 90s. We were looking for something past command and response, past stimulus and reward." He paused. "We wanted dogs that could read intent, not just action. The actual intent underneath the action. It took a long time to understand that the relationship had to go both ways for that to work. You couldn't just train the dog. You had to train yourself to be readable, to be honest in every physical way, every breath and stance and weight distribution, honest in a way that most people aren't, because most people are hiding things from themselves that the dog can feel." He was quiet for a moment. "The program was closed before we finished the work. Programs get closed. Money, politics, personnel changes. It doesn't matter." He gave Kodiak's ear a last slow scratch and withdrew his hand. "But the dogs remember. Not this dog, he wasn't alive then. But it's in the line. Some things persist." Holloway looked at Kodiak, who was still watching Vale. "What happened to the people?" she asked. "From the program." Vale picked up his paperback, looked at the cover without reading it. "What happens to most people when a chapter ends?" he said. "They start another one." He glanced at the departures board above the gate. "Some of them become farmers. Some of them become fishing guides. Some of them go up to Yellowknife to watch their granddaughter play defense and try not to embarrass themselves by crying when she gets on the ice." He stood, and in the standing it happened again, that subtle shift. The shoulders that had been soft and round came into an alignment that was neither aggressive nor performed, just correct, the way a load-bearing structure is correct, because it was built that way and has never stopped being built that way, regardless of what covered it. He slung his carry-on over one shoulder with an ease that had nothing to do with its weight and everything to do with a body that still knew exactly where its center was. He nodded to Leclerc. A single, small nod, the kind that passes between people who do not need to enumerate what they understand about each other, because it is already understood. He looked at Tanguay for a moment, just a moment, and the look held something that wasn't unkind. It was the look of a person who remembers being where you are and found a way through and believes, without being certain, that you will too. To Holloway he said nothing. He just looked at Kodiak one more time, and the dog held his gaze, and something passed between them that Holloway could feel but not name, the way you feel a frequency that falls outside the range of ordinary hearing. Then Thomas Vale walked to the gate agent's desk, presented his boarding pass, and walked down the jetway. He did not look back. Kodiak watched the door for a long time after it closed. He wasn't anxious. He wasn't confused. He was doing what he did when he was learning something, cataloging it, committing it to whatever part of him held the things that mattered. Then he turned and looked up at Holloway, and his tail moved once. Tanguay was standing with his hands at his sides, looking at the closed jetway door. He said, almost to himself, "Who was he?" Leclerc picked up his clipboard. "Someone worth paying attention to," he said. He wasn't being poetic. He was being precise. He walked back toward the security office, and his footsteps on the terminal floor were even and unhurried, the gait of a man who has added something to what he knows and intends to think about it carefully. Holloway scratched behind Kodiak's ears, and the dog leaned into it, solid and warm and completely settled. She didn't know Thomas Vale's history. She didn't know the program, or what it had asked of him, or what it had cost. She knew almost nothing about him except what she had watched him do in the space of 10 minutes in a concourse at Ottawa Airport on a Wednesday afternoon in November. But she thought about what he had said, about the dog reading intent, about honesty in breath and stance and weight, about training yourself to be legible. all the way down, because the animal in front of you would find the truth of you whether you offered it or not. She thought it was probably the most useful thing anyone had ever told her, and it had been said not to her but to the middle distance, by a man who had already moved on before the words landed. The departures board updated. Flight AC 8847 to Yellowknife, boarding complete. Kodiak pressed his side against her leg, and she put her hand on his back, and they stood there together for a moment in the particular quiet of something that is finished. Her real training, she realized, standing there in gate C-17 with her dog's warmth against her knee, had not been the certification program. It had not been the 4 years of work. It had begun 20 minutes ago, and it had been given to her by a grandfather on his way to a hockey game, who had not even known he was giving it.